The volcanic plains of Epsilon 7 stretched endlessly before Kyle Martinez as he guided his survey rover across the blackened terrain, heat shimmering off the cracked ground in waves that made the distant mountains look like they were dancing in the afternoon light. He had been stationed on this remote research outpost for 8 months now, studying the geological formations that made this planet unique among the 73 worlds in this sector. And most days the isolation didn't bother him at all. He actually preferred the quiet solitude to the crowded research. Stations closer to the Galactic Court Day's survey route took him deeper into the volcanic region than he usually ventured, following readings that suggested unusual mineral deposits in one of the older crater formations. The planet's twin suns beat down mercilessly, but the rover's climate control kept the interior comfortable enough that Kyle barely noticed the temperature outside climbing past 200 degrees. He hummed along to an old Earth song playing through his headset, one hand on the controls while the other updated his field notes on the datapad beside him, the sensor array pinned with an anomaly alert just as he crested a ridge overlooking a massive caldera, one that his map showed had been dormant for at least 10,000 years. Kyle slowed the rover and checked the readings, frowning at what he saw: 3 distinct heat signatures clustered together near the caldera's edge, each one pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost biological. His curiosity overrode his caution, as it often did, and he steered the rover down the slope toward the source of the readings. What he found nestled in a sheltered depression made him catch his breath in surprise. 3 eggs, each roughly the size of a human head, sat arranged in a loose triangle on the warm volcanic rock. Their shells were the deepest black he had ever seen, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, but faint patterns of bioluminescence rippled across their surfaces in hypnotic waves of blue and violet. Kyle climbed out of the rover, his environmental suit's cooling system immediately working harder against the ambient heat, and approached the eggs carefully. He had never seen anything like them in the Galactic Biological Database, and he had spent years studying xenobiology before taking this assignment. The eggs were warm to the touch, much warmer than the surrounding rocks, and when he placed his gloved hand on the nearest one, he could feel a faint vibration like a heartbeat. They were alive, unmistakably alive, and completely alone in this hostile environment. Kyle's pseudo-eye chimed in his ear with a warning tone. Unidentified biological material detected. Protocol requires immediate reporting to galactic wildlife authorities and quarantine procedures. Override and mute warnings, Kyle said quickly, already knowing what he was going to do. The galactic wildlife authorities would take weeks to respond to a report from this far out in the frontier, and by then these eggs would be dead from exposure or predation. He couldn't leave them here, not when he had the means to save them. He carefully loaded all 3 eggs into a padded specimen container, securing them with foam padding before placing the container in the rover's climate-controlled cargo bay. The ride back to his habitat module took 2 hours, and Kyle spent the entire journey researching incubation techniques and setting up emergency alerts on his datapad. He had successfully hatched specimens before during his academic work, but never anything this size or from an unknown species. Dr. Rebecca Walsh was waiting at the habitat's airlock when he arrived, her arms crossed and her expression clearly concerned. She was the only other human on Epsilon 7, assigned to study the planet's atmospheric chemistry, and over the past 8 months they had become close friends despite their very different personalities. Your rover's biosensors triggered alerts at the main station, she said as Kyle carefully carried the container inside. What did you find out there? Kyle set the container down on his lab bench and opened it, revealing the 3 black eggs still pulsing with their mysterious light. Rebecca's eyes went wide, and she leaned in for a closer look, her scientific curiosity momentarily overriding her usual caution. I have no idea what they are, Kyle admitted. already pulling up holographic displays to analyze the egg's composition. The database has nothing even close to matching their biological profile. They're unlike any known species in this sector, which means they could be dangerous, Rebecca pointed out, though her tone suggested she was already losing the argument with herself. There are protocols for this. Kyle, strict protocols about interfering with unknown native species. The protocols also say we should preserve life when possible, Kyle countered, setting up an incubation chamber with heating elements and humidity controls. These eggs were alone and exposed. Without intervention, they would have died within days. Rebecca helped him transfer the eggs to the incubation chamber, her hands as gentle as his despite her reservations. They spent the next hour calibrating the environment, matching the temperature and atmospheric composition to the conditions where Kyle found them. The eggs seemed to respond to the familiar environment, their bioluminescent patterns pulsing more brightly and more rhythmically. If these things hatch into something that eats us, I'm going to haunt you, Rebecca said. But she was smiling slightly as she said it. 3 weeks passed in a blur of monitoring and adjusting the incubation chamber settings. Kyle barely left his lab except to eat and sleep, watching the eggs develop through scanners that showed increasing complexity in their internal structures. Whatever was inside was growing rapidly, developing advanced neural networks and muscular systems that suggested they would be mobile immediately after hatching. The first crack appeared in the largest egg at 03:00 hours on a Tuesday. Kyle had fallen asleep at his desk, exhausted from another long day of research, when his alarm system woke him with urgent chiming. He stumbled to the incubation chamber, just in time to see a small, scaled snout push through the widening crack in the obsidian shell. The creature that emerged was simultaneously beautiful and otherworldly. It had a long, serpentine body covered in scales that shifted from black to dark gray depending on the angle of the light. 4 powerful legs ending in curved talons and membranous wings folded against its sides. Its head was elegant and angular, with large eyes that seemed far too intelligent for a newborn. And when it opened its mouth, Kyle saw rows of small, sharp teeth. The hatchling stumbled on unsteady legs, making soft chirping sounds that seemed to echo the biosensor readings Kyle had been monitoring. Within minutes, the other 2 eggs cracked open as well, releasing siblings that were slightly smaller, but otherwise identical to the first. All 3 immediately oriented toward Kyle, their heads tilting in unison as they studied him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Kyle reached into the chamber slowly, letting the hatchling smell his hand. The largest one, which he immediately decided to call Ash, stepped forward and pressed its small head against his palm. The contact sent a shiver up Kyle's arm. The hatchling was warm, almost hot to the touch, and he could feel tiny vibrations running through its body. "Hello there," he whispered, his voice soft and soothing. "Welcome to the world, little ones." The other 2 hatchlings, which Kyle named Ember and Cinder on the spot, crowded forward to touch him as well, their chirping becoming more insistent. It took him a moment to realize they were hungry, and another moment to panic about what to feed them. Rebecca arrived an hour later to find Kyle hand-feeding the 3 hatchlings, a mixture of protein paste and mineral supplements, while they climbed over his lap and arms like affectionate puppies. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the scene with an expression Kyle couldn't quite read. "They've imprinted on you," she finally said, her voice carrying equal parts awe and concern. "Kyle, do you understand what that means? These creatures, whatever they are, now see you as their parent." Kyle looked down at the 3 small dragons, because that was what they looked like. Creatures from ancient Earth mythology, brought to life as they nuzzled against him, seeking warmth and security. Ash had already fallen asleep in the crook of his arm, while Ember and Cinder wrestled playfully with each other nearby. "I know," he said quietly, already feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. I'll take care of them. Rebecca, I'll keep them safe. He had no way of knowing, in that moment, just how completely those roles would reverse, or how much the galaxy would come to fear the bond he was forming with these innocent hatchlings. 6 months transformed the tiny hatchlings into creatures that barely fit inside Kyle's expanded habitat module, their growth rate far exceeding anything he had predicted from his initial scans. Ash, the largest of the three, now stood as tall as Kyle's waist when on all 4 legs, with wings that could span nearly 3 meters when fully extended. Ember had developed the most vibrant coloring, scales that caught the light with hints of deep crimson along the edges, while Cinder remained the smallest, but showed an almost supernatural awareness of everything happening around him. Kyle had fallen into a routine with his unusual family, waking each morning to find all 3 dragons curled around his sleeping area, their combined body heat making climate control nearly unnecessary. They followed him everywhere throughout the habitat, Ash typically taking the lead with protective instincts that grew stronger each day, Ember investigating every tool and piece of equipment with endless curiosity, and Cinder staying close to Kyle's side, seeming to sense his moods before he fully recognized them himself. Rebecca had moved beyond her initial concerns and now helped Kyle document the dragon's development, though her scientific observations were increasingly tinged with worry. The creatures displayed abilities that shouldn't exist in any natural organism. They could regulate their core temperature to extremes, surviving in the freezing cold of the habitat's storage bay or the intense heat of the volcanic plains without any distress. They communicated with each other through sounds below human hearing range, coordinating their movements with perfect precision, even when separated by walls and distance. "Look at these readings," Rebecca said one afternoon, pulling up holographic displays that showed the dragon's latest metabolic scans. Their cellular structure can withstand temperatures that would vaporize most known materials, and their bones have a density that makes titanium look fragile. Kyle, these aren't just unusual creatures. They're engineered for something. Kyle watched Ember, trying to fit through a doorway that had become too small for the growing dragon. The creature's problem-solving approach both amusing and impressive. Everything about them suggests adaptation to extreme environments, he agreed, helping Ember find a wider route. But that doesn't make them dangerous, just resilient. The Galactic Council has strict classifications for species this physically capable, Rebecca pressed, lowering her voice even though they were alone. "If anyone finds out what you're raising here, then we don't tell anyone," Kyle interrupted, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. "They're not hurting anyone, Rebecca. They're gentle and intelligent, and they deserve a chance to live without being classified as threats." The conversation ended there, but Kyle could see the conflict in his friend's eyes. She cared about the dragons too, had spent hours playing with them and teaching them to recognize different sounds and signals. But her scientific training demanded that she consider the broader implications of their existence. That night, as Kyle prepared their evening meal, a mixture of processed proteins and mineral compounds that the dragons seemed to enjoy, Cinder suddenly lifted her head and made a low, rumbling sound that Kyle had never heard before. Within seconds, Ash and Ember joined in, all 3 dragons oriented toward the habitat's southern wall with their bodies tense and alert. "What is it?" Kyle asked, moving toward them cautiously. He had learned to trust the dragon's instincts over the past months, and their behavior now suggested something was very wrong. The habitat's emergency alarms answered his question, blaring warnings about a massive volcanic eruption forming in the caldera system 15 kilometers to the south. Automated systems immediately began reinforcing the habitat's protective shields. But the seismic readings showed this wasn't an ordinary eruption. The magma pressure building underground was off the scale, suggesting a catastrophic release of energy that could overwhelm their defenses. Rebecca burst into the main lab, her face pale as she checked the readouts. The shield generators are already at maximum capacity, and the eruption hasn't even started," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Kyle, we need to evacuate to the emergency bunker now." They ran through the habitat together, the dragons following close behind, despite Kyle's attempts to make them stay in the safer interior sections. The bunker was a reinforced chamber designed to withstand anything short of a direct meteor impact, stocked with supplies and communication equipment to call for rescue. Kyle sealed the door behind them just as the first shockwave hit, rattling the entire structure hard enough to throw them to the floor. The dragons immediately surrounded Kyle and Rebecca, pressing close as if trying to shield them with their own bodies. Outside the bunker, through the thick walls, they could hear the roar of the eruption, a sound like reality itself tearing apart. The habitat sensors showed toxic gases flooding the complex, acids and superheated particles that would kill a human in seconds. Then, the shield generators failed with a cascading series of explosions, and poisonous atmosphere began seeping into the bunker through ventilation systems that couldn't close fast enough. Kyle grabbed Rebecca and pulled her toward the emergency respirators, but he could already feel the burning in his lungs. See the readouts showing lethal concentrations of sulfur compounds and carbon particles. Ash moved first, positioning herself directly over Kyle and opening her jaws wide. Instead of fire or sound, she exhaled a shimmering field of energy that spread through the air like liquid light, surrounding both humans in a protective bubble. Ember and Cinder joined her immediately, adding their own energy to the field until it covered the entire bunker interior. The toxic gases hit the field and simply stopped, dissolving into harmless particles that drifted to the floor. Kyle watched in amazement as his datapad showed the air quality returning to normal, the lethal compounds being broken down at a molecular level by whatever the dragons were generating. The three of them maintained the field for hours, never wavering, never showing signs of fatigue, while the volcanic eruption raged outside. When the shaking finally stopped and the habitat's backup systems confirmed the immediate danger had passed, the dragons collapsed in exhaustion, their breathing heavy and their scales dull from the effort. Kyle immediately checked each of them, running his hands over their bodies to make sure they weren't injured, while Rebecca stared at her datapad with an expression of shocked disbelief. "That energy field," she whispered, pulling up the sensor recordings. "Kyle, do you understand what they just did? They generated a stable molecular conversion field without any equipment, without any external power source. The technology is theoretical, something the most advanced species in the galaxy haven't achieved. And you dragons did it instinctively to save us." Kyle sat on the floor with Ash's head in his lap, stroking her scales while she recovered. "They protected their family," he said simply. "That's all that matters to me." But even as he said it, he could see the fear growing in Rebecca's eyes, and he knew why. Creatures this powerful, this capable of manipulating energy at fundamental levels, would terrify anyone who understood the implications. If the Galactic Council learned about them, if anyone with authority discovered what Kyle had raised from those 3 abandoned eggs, his family would be taken from him. The habitat's long-range sensors picked up a ship entering orbit 3 days later, a merchant vessel that had no scheduled reason to be in this system. Kyle watched the readings with growing dread as the ship performed multiple scanning passes over their location, clearly searching for something specific. Rebecca pulled up the communication logs and found what Kyle feared most: an encrypted transmission sent from the merchant ship immediately after detecting the energy signature from the dragon's protective field. The message was addressed to the Galactic Council's Security Division, specifically to the department that monitored dangerous species and potential threats to civilized space. "They know," Rebecca said quietly, her hand finding Kyle's shoulder in a gesture of support and sympathy. "Kyle, someone knows what's down here, and they've told the council. They're coming?" Kyle looked at his 3 dragons, now fully recovered and playing together in the corner of the lab, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Ash tackled Ember in a friendly wrestling match while Cinder supervised from a safe distance, making soft sounds that might have been laughter. They were happy, healthy, and loved. Everything children should be regardless of their species. Let them come, Kyle said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even himself. I'm not giving up my family without a fight. Whatever happens next, we face it together. He gathered Ash, Ember, and Cinder close, feeling their warmth and trust, knowing that the bond between them was stronger than any protocol or regulation. The galaxy might see them as threats, but Kyle saw them for what they truly were, his children, and he would protect them with everything he had. The stars above Epsilon 7 continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. As somewhere in the depths of space, a council ship received its orders and set course for a remote research outpost where an impossible family waited for judgment. The council ship arrived exactly 1 week after the merchant vessel's report, dropping out of hyperspace with the kind of precision that suggested military training. Kyle watched through the habitat's external cameras as 2 sleek escort vessels took flanking positions while the main ship established orbit. Its hull, bearing the distinctive markings of the Galactic Preservation Force, a division that most frontier colonists hope never to encounter. Commander Lisa Chen made contact within the hour, her voice crisp and professional over the communication channel. Research Station, Epsilon 7. This is GPF. Commander Chen requesting immediate permission to land an investigation team. We have reports of unauthorized biological specimens requiring classification and containment. Kyle exchanged a long look with Rebecca before responding. Commander Chen, this is Kyle Martinez, Station Director. I'm not sure what reports you've received, but there's nothing here that poses any threat to galactic safety. There was a pause before Chung responded, and when she did, her tone had hardened noticeably. Martinez, we have confirmed energy signatures matching extinct biological warfare protocols, specifically patterns associated with species deemed too dangerous for continued existence. You will grant us access immediately, or we will invoke emergency authority under Section 7 of the Preservation Charter. Rebecca's hand covered her mouth as she processed the implications. Biological warfare protocols? She whispered. Kyle, what have we been living with? The dragons, now the size of horses and still growing, sensed the tension in the habitat. Ash moved to stand between Kyle and the door, her posture protective, while Ember and Cinder flanked him on either side, their eyes fixed on the communication console as if they could see the threat coming through it. Kyle authorized the landing against every instinct screaming at him to refuse, knowing that resistance would only make things worse. 30 minutes later, Commander Chen and a squad of heavily armed soldiers marched into his laboratory, their weapons raised and their expressions showing the kind of fear that makes people dangerous. Chen herself was a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many horrors. And when her gaze fell on Ash, Ember, and Cinder, all color drained from her face. Sweet stars above, she breathed, her hand moving toward her sidearm before she caught herself. Do you have any idea what you've done? Those are Pyronox draconids, Martinez. They're supposed to be extinct, dead for 5,000 years after they nearly destroyed 7 star systems. Kyle stepped forward, positioning himself between the soldiers and his dragons. These creatures have never harmed anyone, he said firmly. I raised them from eggs, cared for them every day of their lives. They're not monsters. They're my family. Chun pulled out a datapad and projected holographic images that made Kyle's blood run cold. Burning cities stretching across entire continents, starships reduced to molten debris, populations in the billions simply gone. The images cycled through scene after scene of destruction, each one more horrific than the last. And at the center of every image were creatures that looked exactly like ash. Ember and Cinder. The Pyronox War lasted 300 years, Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of historical trauma. Every attempt at communication failed because these creatures don't think like us. They're apex predators designed by evolution to consume and destroy. They reproduce rapidly. They can't be killed by conventional weapons. And a single adult Pyronox can generate enough heat to crack a planet's crust. Rebecca had gone very pale, backing away from the dragons she had helped raise. Kyle, if this is true, it doesn't matter what happened 5,000 years ago, Kyle interrupted, his voice rising with emotion. Ash, Ember, and Cinder have never shown aggression except in self-defense. They saved our lives during the eruption. They've been gentle and loving every single day, and I won't let you murder them based on the actions of their ancestors. Chine's expression softened slightly, showing genuine sympathy beneath her military bearing. I understand you formed an attachment, she said more gently. But you have to understand the risk adult Pyronox don't have the capacity for restraint or mercy. As they mature, their predatory instincts will override any training or bonding. What you've raised as pets will become planet killers, and by then it will be too late to stop them. Ash growled low in her throat, the sound resonating through the habitat's walls. Ember and Cinder joined her, creating a harmonic vibration that made the soldiers raise their weapons nervously. Kyle could feel the temperature in the room rising as the dragons responded to the perceived threat. Against their family, stand down. Chun ordered her troops, though she didn't lower her own weapon. Martinez, I'm giving you 1 hour to say goodbye to these creatures. After that, they will be humanely terminated according to galactic preservation protocols. I take no pleasure in this, but I cannot allow another Pyronox outbreak, no matter how unlikely you believe it to be. The hour that followed was the longest of Kyle's life. He sat with his 3 dragons in the habitat's common area, stroking their scales and telling them stories about Earth, about the mountains and oceans they would never see. Ash rested her massive head on his lap, her eyes reflecting an intelligence that Kyle knew exceeded what most species gave her credit for. Ember curled around his other side, making soft sounds of contentment, while Cinder watched the armed soldiers through the doorway with an expression that looked disturbingly calculating. Rebecca joined him halfway through the hour, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered, sitting beside him. I should have fought harder to protect them, should have done more. You helped me raise them? Kyle said, managing a weak smile. That's more than most people would have done. You gave them love, and that matters. Commander Chun appeared in the doorway with 15 minutes remaining, her expression troubled. Martinez, I need you to understand something. The decision to eliminate the Pyronox species wasn't made lightly. The Council tried everything to coexist with them, attempted communication through every known method, even relocated populations to unpopulated systems. Nothing worked because the Pyronox don't have the neurological capacity for complex social bonds. Beyond their immediate pack, Kyle looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. Then explain why these 3 have bonded with me, he challenged. Explain why they show affection, why they play, why they protected Rebecca and me during the eruption when they could have just saved themselves, if they're mindless killers. How do you account for that? Chun opened her mouth to respond, but whatever she was about to say was cut off by the blaring of emergency alarms throughout the station. Her hand went to her communication earpiece, and her expression transformed from concern to horrified in the span of a heartbeat. All units. Battle stations. She barked into her communicator. Carthax raiding fleet, 6 warships. They've disabled the Intrepid, and are beginning boarding operations. This is not a drill. The Carthax were one of the galaxy's most feared pirate organizations. Slavers and murderers who prey on isolated outposts exactly like Epsilon 7. Kyle had heard stories about their raids, about the things they did to captured colonists, and he felt ice flood his veins at the thought of Rebecca or himself falling into their hands. Chun's soldiers rushed to defensive positions. But Kyle could see the calculation in the commander's eyes. She had 2 escort ships, one already disabled, and maybe 30 troops against 6 warships full of Carthax raiders. It was a battle they couldn't win, not without help. The commander looked at Kyle, then at the 3 dragons sitting calmly despite the chaos erupting around them. "If I give you authorization," she said slowly, each word clearly costing her something, "could you get them to fight? Could you control them enough to target only the Carthax ships?" Kyle stood, his heart pounding. "I don't control them," he said quietly, "but I can ask them. They understand more than you know." He walked to Ash, placing both hands on her enormous head and looking directly into her eyes. "That people are coming," he said, using the simple language he always spoke to them with. "They want to hurt our family, want to take Rebecca and me away. I need you to protect everyone here, but only fight the ones who attack us, understand? No killing unless there's no other choice." Ash's eyes blazed with understanding and something fiercer. She turned to her siblings and made a series of complex sounds in that subsonic language they used among themselves. Ember and Cinder responded immediately, their bodies already beginning to change. The transformation was terrifying in its beauty. The 3 dragons grew before everyone's eyes, their bodies expanding and shifting as they achieved what Kyle realized was their true adult form. Scales that had been dark gray now glowed with inner fire, shifting to brilliant crimson and gold. Wings unfurled to their full span, easily 20 meters across. And when they opened their mouths, the temperature in the room spiked high enough to trigger heat warnings. They launched through the habitat's ceiling as if the reinforced material was paper, leaving gaping holes that immediately sealed with emergency force fields. Through the external cameras, Kyle watched his children take to the sky above Epsilon 7. 3 blazing forms that moved with impossible grace and speed toward the descending Carthax ships. Commander Chun stood frozen beside him, her weapon hanging forgotten in her hand. The battle above Epsilon 7 was unlike anything Kyle had ever witnessed, even in the historical combat recordings he had studied during his academy training. Ash hit the lead Carthax warship at speeds that should have torn her apart, her body engulfed in flames that burned hotter than the planet's volcanic core. And instead of destroying the vessel completely, she released a concentrated beam of plasma that carved through the ship's shield generators with surgical precision. The Carthax vessel's defensive systems collapsed in seconds, leaving it vulnerable but intact. The pirate crew inside would be terrified but alive, exactly as Kyle had asked. Ember took the second ship, her approach more tactical, circling the warship while releasing electromagnetic pulses that disrupted its weapon systems without damaging the life support or crew quarters. Cinder, smallest but somehow most frightening, targeted the remaining 4 ships simultaneously, her movements impossibly fast as she wove between their defensive fire. Commander Chun watched the external feeds with an expression of absolute disbelief. "This isn't possible," she kept muttering, checking and rechecking her sensor readings. "Pyronox fight in berserker rages. They don't show tactical thinking or restraint. They certainly don't coordinate complex attack patterns, like a trained military squadron." Kyle said nothing, too focused on watching his children demonstrate everything he had tried to tell Chun about them. They were powerful beyond measure, capable of the kind of destruction shown in those historical images. But they chose not to use that power indiscriminately. Every strike was calculated, every burst of energy precisely controlled to disable rather than destroy the Carthax raiders. Realizing they faced something far beyond their capacity to fight, attempted to retreat. Their remaining ships turned toward the system's edge, engines burning at maximum thrust, but the dragons moved faster. Ash overtook 3 ships in a single diving maneuver, her wing membranes generating fields that dampened their hyperspace drives. Ember and Cinder herded the other vessels back toward Epsilon 7 like sheepdogs managing livestock. Their presence alone enough to keep the pirates from attempting any desperate attacks. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes from first contact to the Carthax fleet's complete surrender. 6 warships, each capable of devastating an undefended colony, sat disabled in orbit around the research station, their crews broadcasting frantic capitulation signals. The dragons circled the captured vessels in a protective formation, clearly understanding that their job was to guard the defeated enemies until the Council forces could take custody. Commander Chen's remaining escort ship moved to secure the Carthax vessels while rescue teams worked to evacuate the disabled Intrepid. Chen herself stood in Kyle's laboratory, staring at the external cameras that showed the 3 dragons maintaining their vigil. And her hands were shaking slightly as she pulled up combat analysis data on her datapad. "Martinez, do you understand what I'm looking at?" she asked, her voice hollow. In the entire Pyronox War, across 3 centuries of conflict, there's not a single recorded instance of them showing mercy to defeated enemies. They fought until everything was dead or burning, including themselves. There was no concept of surrender, no prisoners taken, no quarter given. Rebecca had returned to the lab after helping injured soldiers, a medical training put to use during the chaos. The historical records could be wrong, she suggested quietly. Or incomplete. Maybe the Pyronox responded the way they did because they were defending themselves against an enemy that gave them no choice. Chun shook her head slowly. 7 member species of the Galactic Council went extinct during that war, she said. Entire civilizations that tried every possible approach to peace. The Pyronox responded to diplomatic envoys the same way they responded to military fleets, with total destruction. Then maybe, Kyle said carefully, the problem wasn't the Pyronox themselves, but how they were raised. If the first contacts were all hostile, if they grew up in an environment where everything was a threat, then they would respond as threats. Ash, Ember, and Cinder grew up surrounded by love and safety, so they learned different responses. The commander looked at him for a long moment, and Kyle could see the conflict playing out behind her eyes. Everything her training told her about the Pyronox was being contradicted by what she had just witnessed. But the weight of historical trauma and 5,000 years of galactic policy wasn't easily overcome. "I need to call this in," she finally said. "This situation is beyond my authority to resolve. The Council Tribunal will have to make a decision about what happens next." The tribunal convened 3 days later via quantum communication link. A holographic assembly of representatives from 40 different species filling Kyle's laboratory with translucent figures. The senior arbiter was a Velosian named Kethra, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated deep thought. She had reviewed all the evidence, watched the combat recordings a dozen times, and interviewed both Kyle and Commander Chun extensively. This tribunal must consider 3 critical questions, Kethra announced, her voice carrying harmonics that the translation software struggled to process. First, whether these Pyronox draconids represent a credible threat to galactic stability. Second, whether the individual known as Kyle Martinez acted with criminal negligence in raising them. And third, what precedent we establish regarding extinct species and their potential rehabilitation. Kyle stood before the assembled tribunal, acutely aware that he was arguing for his family's lives against the combined authority of galactic civilization. The Pyronox War happened because fear led to violence, and violence led to more fear, he said, choosing his words carefully. No one tried to understand them, to communicate, to find common ground. They were labeled as monsters and treated accordingly. So they became what everyone expected, one of the tribunal members. A heavily armored Krenth made a gesture of disagreement. The historical records are clear dozens of attempts at peaceful contact were made before military action became necessary. Attempts made by adults toward other adults, Kyle countered. What I did was different. I raised them from hatching, taught them values and behaviors, showed them a universe where not everything is a threat to be destroyed. They learned compassion and restraint because those were the examples I gave them. Rebecca stepped forward to support him. I've studied their development extensively, she said, projecting neural scan data. The Pyronox brain structure includes advanced cognitive centers that were previously thought to be vestigial. Those centers are fully active in these 3 specimens. Supporting complex emotional processing and moral reasoning, they can make ethical choices, not just react on instinct. Commander Chun, surprisingly, added her own testimony. I came here prepared to terminate 3 dangerous creatures, she admitted. What I found instead were intelligent beings who understood context, recognized allies from enemies, and showed restraint in combat that would be impressive even in trained military personnel. They had opportunities to kill during the battle, but chose not to. Even when doing so would have been tactically simpler. The tribunal deliberated for hours while Kyle waited with his dragons, who had been allowed to land near the habitat under heavy guard. Ash rested her massive head on his shoulder, making soft rumbling sounds that Kyle had learned meant contentment. Ember and Cinder lay on either side of him, their warmth a comfort against the cold fear settling in his chest. When the tribunal reconvened, Arbiter Kethris' crystalline form pulsed with colors that suggested a difficult consensus. This tribunal has reached a decision, she announced. The evidence suggests that Pyronox draconids, when raised in appropriate circumstances by individuals capable of providing proper guidance, can develop beyond their historical behavioral patterns. Kyle felt hope surge through him, but Kethro wasn't finished. However, we cannot ignore the catastrophic potential these creatures represent. A single lapse in judgment, one moment of uncontrolled instinct, could result in casualties numbered in millions. Therefore, this tribunal proposes a conditional arrangement. The terms were both better and worse than Kyle had feared. Ash, Ember, and Cinder would be allowed to live, but only under strict conditions. Epsilon 7 would be designated a restricted sanctuary world with no other inhabitants allowed. Kyle would retain custody as their guardian, but he would be monitored constantly, and any sign of dangerous behavior would result in immediate intervention. The dragons themselves would be fitted with tracking devices and subjected to regular behavioral assessments. Additionally, Kethra continued, you will cooperate with xenobiological researchers, studying whether other Pyronox eggs might exist elsewhere in the galaxy, and whether rehabilitation programs could be developed for any specimens found. This represents a significant shift in galactic policy. Martinez, you and your family will be closely watched by those who hope you succeed and those who expect you to fail. Kyle looked at his 3 dragons, seeing the trust in their eyes, and made his decision. I accept the tribunal's terms, he said. My family stays together and will prove that change is possible, not just for the Pyronox, but for how the galaxy thinks about species we've labeled as irredeemable. The holographic tribunal flickered and vanished, leaving Kyle alone with. The months following the tribunal's decision transformed Epsilon 7 from a quiet research outpost into the galaxy's most closely monitored location. Observation satellites ringed the planet in orbital patterns that left no blind spots. Automated sensors tracked every movement the dragons made, and a rotating staff of xenobiologists arrived quarterly to conduct behavioral assessments that Kyle found invasive but necessary to maintain the fragile peace. Kyle had adapted to his new role as both guardian and ambassador. For a species the galaxy still feared, he maintained detailed logs of the dragons' daily activities, their social interactions, their learning progress, and every instance where they demonstrated the kind of restraint and moral reasoning that contradicted 5,000 years of historical prejudice. Rebecca had chosen to stay despite being offered transfers to prestigious research positions, claiming that documenting the dragon's development was too important to abandon. Ash had grown into her role as the protective leader of the small family group, her massive form now requiring specially reinforced living spaces. She showed an almost human-like understanding of responsibility, often positioning herself between Kyle and any perceived threats, whether those threats were incoming storms or visiting council inspectors. Her intelligence continued to develop in ways that surprised even Kyle, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that suggested abstract reasoning embers. Curiosity had evolved into something resembling scientific inquiry. She spent hours examining the habitat's equipment, learning through observation how various systems functioned. Kyle had caught her multiple times, attempting to repair damaged machinery, her talons manipulating tools with surprising delicacy. She had even begun responding to simple mathematical concepts, arranging objects in patterns that suggested an understanding of basic geometry. Cinder remained the most enigmatic of the three, her emotional sensitivity developing into something that the behavioral researchers described as empathic capability. She could sense Kyle's moods with uncanny accuracy, often responding to his emotional state before he fully recognized it himself. When Rebecca was upset about a failed experiment, Cinder would stay close to her, offering silent comfort. The researchers theorized that she was detecting subtle chemical changes in human pheromones, but Kyle suspected it went deeper than mere biology. The real test of the tribunal's decision came 8 months after the Carthax incident. A distress signal reached Epsilon 7 from a colony ship that had suffered catastrophic engine failure in a nearby system. The ship carried 2,000 civilians, mostly families with young children, and their life support was failing. The nearest council rescue vessel was 3 days away, but the colony ship's crew estimated they had less than 12 hours before oxygen levels became critical. Kyle received the distress call simultaneously with the monitoring station's commander, a stern Velosian named Kursith, who had replaced Chun after the tribunal. Kursith immediately began calculating response options, but the mathematics were brutal. No ship in range could reach the colony vessel in time, and attempting a rescue with insufficient resources would likely result in more deaths. There might be another option, Kyle said carefully, knowing how his suggestion would be received. Ash, Ember, and Cinder can survive in vacuum, and they can generate the energy fields necessary to stabilize a failing ship if we could get them there fast enough. Absolutely not, Kirsten interrupted, her crystalline form pulsing with colors that indicated alarm. The tribunal's conditions specifically prohibit taking the Pyronox off-world without extensive authorization protocols. We would need approval from at least 15 council members, and that process takes weeks. Those people will be dead in hours, Kyle pressed. We have the capability to save them, and you're telling me we should let 2,000 civilians die because of bureaucratic procedures? Rebecca pulled up the colony ship's passenger manifest, her face pale as she read the demographics. Kyle, there are 400 children under the age of 10 on that ship, she said quietly. If we do nothing, Costa's form flickered with the colors of internal conflict. She had responsibilities to the council, protocols that existed for very good reasons, but she also had a moral compass that wouldn't let her ignore dying children. After a long moment, she made a decision that Kyle knew could end her career. I will authorize an emergency deployment under my personal authority, she said, each word careful and deliberate. But Martinez, if your dragons show any signs of losing control, any indication that they might threaten that colony ship or its passengers, I will trigger the failsafe protocols. Do you understand what that means? Kyle understood perfectly. The tracking devices implanted in the dragons included kill switches, powerful enough to stop their hearts instantly. It was the tribunal's insurance policy, the thing that allowed them to exist under constant death sentences. "They won't lose control," he said with more confidence than he felt. "They'll save those people, getting 3 fully grown Pyranox draconids to a failing colony ship required coordination with the only vessel in range capable of generating a large enough hyperspace field, an automated cargo hauler that had no crew to object to traveling with creatures that could vaporize it." Kyle accompanied his dragons into the hauler's vast cargo bay, bringing emergency supplies and communications equipment. The journey through hyperspace took 6 hours, during which Kyle talked to the dragons constantly, explaining what they would find and what he needed them to do. Ash listened with focused intensity, her massive head tilted in concentration. Ember paced the cargo bay, her nervous energy manifesting in small bursts of flame that she carefully directed away from the ship's systems. Cinder stayed pressed against Kyle's side, absorbing his anxiety and reflecting calm back at him when they dropped out of hyperspace. The colony ship Meridian Hope was in worse condition than the initial reports suggested. Hull breaches vented atmosphere in multiple locations. The main reactor was in cascade failure, and emergency power was already failing in the civilian quarters. Kyle could see through the viewports into sections where families huddled together in rapidly cooling compartments. Parents holding children who didn't understand why the air was getting so cold and thin. "Remember what we talked about," Kyle said to his dragons, his hands on each of their heads. "Those people in there are like Rebecca and me. They need protecting. Need you to be gentle and careful, even though you're scared. Can you do this for me?" All 3 dragons responded with vocalizations that Kyle had learned meant affirmation. They launched from the cargo hauler in perfect formation, approaching the Meridian Hope from different angles. Ash went directly to the failing reactor, her body absorbing the dangerous radiation leaking from the containment breach while she used precisely controlled plasma bursts to seal the cracks. Ember moved along the hull, her energy fields patching the breaches and preventing further atmosphere loss. Cinder did something that made Kyle's heart swell with pride. She entered the ship through one of the larger breaches and began moving through the compartments, using her body heat to warm the coldest sections while her presence kept panicking civilians calm. The colony ship's captain, a grizzled human named Jake Porter, broadcast continuous updates as the dragons worked. "I don't know what those creatures are." His voice came through with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "But they're saving us. One of them is literally hugging my engineering crew to keep them from freezing, while another one is doing repairs that should be impossible without a full shipyard." It took 4 hours of constant work before the Meridian Hope was stable enough to limp to the nearest station under its own power. The dragons had expended enormous amounts of energy, their scales dulled and their movements slow with exhaustion, but they had saved every single person aboard. As they returned to the cargo hauler, Kyle watched the colony ship's viewports fill with faces. Parents holding children up to see the dragons that had rescued them. Crew members pressing their hands against the glass in gestures of gratitude back on Epsilon 7. Cursith filed her report with the kind of detail that would either vindicate her decision or end her career. The tribunal reconvened within days. But this time, the holographic assembly included representatives from the Meridian Hope's home colony, civilian advocacy groups, and species that had lost populations to the original Pyranox war arbiter. Kethra opened the proceedings with an acknowledgement that changed everything. "This tribunal has reviewed Commander Cursith's emergency authorization and the subsequent rescue operation," she announced. "The evidence shows that the Pyranox specimens under Kyle Martinez's guardianship not only successfully completed a complex rescue mission, but did so with a level of care and precision that minimized risk to the civilian population." Abria. representative from one of the war survivor species. A Theln whose ancestors had fought the original Pyranox stood to speak. My people lost 3 colony worlds to the creatures we thought were mindless destroyers, she said, her multiple voices harmonizing in the Theln manner. But after reviewing footage of these dragons, choosing to comfort frightened children rather than simply complete their technical tasks, I must acknowledge that perhaps our understanding was incomplete. The tribunal's decision this time was unanimous.